In the previous video, we downloaded a zip file from start.spring.io with a few different libraries selected. And here what we want to do is come into IntelliJ, and in IntelliJ we want to open up that project. So we just want to come to File, we'll click on Open. I can come into my Spring 6 directory, and here I've copied all the files into my folder of spring-6.web app. You can see here these are the files that were in the zip file. And in IntelliJ, I just have to say open, and it's going to open this up as a project. It will detect the Maven POM in there and load up that project. So now I'm just going to click on open. And had a little error there. We can see that the Maven wrapper was installed. So that is all good. We can close that. We can close out the tips as well. Close that dialog and that down. And here, because I have this as a GitHub repository that these files have not been checked in, so that's why they're red. I will be checking these into GitHub for your reference, and there will be a link to the repository in the course resources. But here what I want to do is take a look at something. First, you can see the structure here of the directory structure, so how things are laid out. Let me toggle over to Chrome. This is a standard directory layout for Apache Maven. That's what we're going to be following. Maven files it, and also by default, Gradle will file this. And this is really how things are organized by default. So Spring Boot is following a default structure that was established by the Maven project. I was working in Java before this existed, and every project was a little bit different. So this is a really nice layout because your build tools, this gives your build tools a standard. So the standard is source main Java. That's where your Java source files are going to be. Source main resources. And this is going to be any configuration files, any text files, any property files, things like that. And then we don't see filters used very much. These are resource filter files. I've honestly never used that. Web app, that is going to be if you are building a WAR file. We do not need that in a Spring Boot context because we'll be running with embedded Tomcat. And then also we have source test. So similar structure, source test Java, source test resources, and filters. These are going to be for testing. We will definitely be getting into that in the course. And then source IT, integration test. We won't see that, as well as assembly and site. These are different Maven options. You can have Maven generate a website for your project. We won't be looking at that in the course. And then also we have project license and then a readme.txt. Here we will be using a readme.md for display on GitHub. But the primary thing that we are going to be concerned with is source main Java. Those are the main application files. Source test Java. Those are going to be the test classes that we write. So let's toggle back over to IntelliJ. And here, I brought up IntelliJ. We want to take a look at the POM file that was generated. We briefly looked at this on the website. You can see here we are inheriting dependencies from the Spring Boot starter parent. So this is going to give us what's called curated dependencies from Spring Boot. So that's going to be brought into the project. You can see here we are setting to Java 17. We selected Spring Data JPA, so we are getting a Spring Boot starter for JPA, as well as a Spring Boot starter for web, and then the H2 in-memory database. So now what I want to do is come over to Maven, and here I'm going to come in and take a look at the dependencies. First, we want to take a look at the Spring Boot starter for web. So this is a Spring Boot starter. This gives us a set of curated dependencies. See, we come in with the Spring Boot starter that gives us Spring Boot. Spring Boot auto configuration, we'll be exploring that more in the course. A logging default. We have the Jakarta annotation API. And here you can see that we are bringing Spring Core 6.0, so that's where we get Spring Framework 6. The starter for web also brings in JSON. This is going to bring in our Jackson dependencies. We also get a embedded Tomcat instance. And let me collapse these so we can see a little bit more. We have the Spring Web. So this brings in Spring Beans, Spring Core, as well as Spring Web MVC. So this brings in Spring Web MVC and all the related dependencies. What's important about this is before Spring Boot, you were responsible for figuring out all these dependencies. Here, we don't need to do this. We bring in the starters. The starters bring in a set of curated dependencies by the Spring team. So not only do we get the proper necessary dependencies being brought into our project, but we also get the proper versions, more importantly. And let me collapse this. The final plugin that we want to look at is our final dependency is the Spring Boot Starter Test. Here we can see that this is bringing in JUnit 5, Makito, JSON assert, Spring Test. So we not only get JUnit and also Makito, we'll be looking at these coming up in the course as well, but we do get everything that we need for doing test assertions and some auto configuration for testing. So we get a nice library there. So we have a lot of tools by default being brought into our application that will be available there for our use. And then, of course, we are getting the H2 in-memory database. So I'll go ahead and collapse that. The other things that the Spring Boot Starter will include is a web application. This is your Java main class. So this is what will start up the Spring Boot application. So this is your starting point for the application. And then you do get a JUnit test by default. And don't understand this yet, but this Spring goes through, and when it starts up, it builds what's called a context. And this is going to get initialized. And this test just makes sure that the Spring configuration is happy as far as being able to start up. There's a lot of things that can happen. If you have something misconfigured, startup could fail. So this is really just kind of a sanity test to make sure that everything is able to start up. And then finally, we do get a help. This is also brought down. And the help can be handy. You can see here, we're using Apache Maven. There's a link to the Maven plugin reference guide, OCI, Spring Web, Spring Data JPA. So you do have a number of basically links to getting started tutorials. And if you wish, you could go ahead and explore that. There's some pretty good information there that you might want to read on your own with Spring Framework. So this right now, I have not touched anything. I only downloaded that zip file from start.spring.io with the selected dependencies. I am going to check that into the GitHub repository. I do want to point out one of the functions of Git. So inside the project structure inside of GitHub, you will see a resources folder. But by default, the way GitHub behaves, it does not bring in empty directories. So when I load this up into GitHub, static and templates will not be there. If you do need to add those resources from something that you checked out in GitHub, you will need to manually create these two directories. These are default directories that Spring Boot will be looking for if we have static web resources or if we have time-leaf templates. So those are two things that we'll need to look at. Right now, we don't need to be concerned with that. We will create those if we need it coming up in the course. But do want to point out that this is as is that I downloaded from start.spring.io. So this is the default project that we get created for us from the Spring application.